Want to stay up to date with everything that's happening on the show? Or do you have a story that you'd like to submit for one of our Listener Stories episodes? You can get in touch with the show via the website at www.hauntedukpodcast.com, on Instagram at hauntedukpodcast, on X at hauntedukpod, or you can email us at contactus@hauntedukpodcast.com. We're also on Facebook and TikTok. And if you want to support the show, you can do it via either Patreon or Ko-fi. Both platforms have exactly the same content, but work in slightly different ways. One of the advantages of Patreon is its sleek user interface, but if you want to avoid those pesky additional charges Apple, Google, and Patreon apply to your subscription, then why not give Ko-fi a try? Simply open a browser window and type ko-fi/Haunted UK Podcast. That's Ko-fi/Haunted UK Podcast, and you'll soon find us. Whichever platform you choose, we're sure you'll enjoy the bonus content. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the episode. My grandfather, being the gentleman he is, graciously offered to give them a lift. He drove the women home, and in true Irish fashion, they invited him in for a cup of tea to say thanks. My grandfather accepted their offer and went into the house. Upon entering, my grandfather instantly felt a heaviness in the air, a feeling he'd never felt before. This is episode 60 of the Haunted UK podcast, and it's time for Beyond the Gates and Other Listener Stories, Part 1. So, coming to the end of another season means that we're here once again. Listener Stories. And as always, we have an amazing selection for you to listen to. It's always an absolute pleasure, and a frightening experience very often, to read through all of your stories and to assemble them into these brilliant episodes. So with that said, it's time to dim the lights, time to get comfortable, and time to listen to your stories. Our first story had to be this. A story at a place very close to the Haunted UK podcast's home and heart, Haden Hill House, which is in Halesowen in the UK, where the Haunted UK podcast is based. We released an episode in Season 1 about the stories at this purportedly very haunted location, and we're very excited to get an insider's take on it. We're very thankful to Mike, who used to work there, for sharing his experiences. Here is Mike's story. Good morning. I listened to your podcast regarding the events and stories about Haden Hill House and Haden Hall. I used to work on the Tudor side of the house that was connected to the later side. I was part of the plastering team that had to use Tudor-style materials such as sand and lime plaster, with horsehair or natural fibres for the undercoat, and a seaside sand and lime for the white top coat finish. Whilst working there, we would walk around the building whilst waiting for coats of plaster to dry, usually going down into the cellar from the front entrance and down the stairs to the first room that was called the holding cell. There were bars on a small window, and it was dark, damp and very atmospheric. Going down further, the next room was an open space with obvious bricked-up doorways. When I asked what was behind them, the site manager just shook his head and said, "You don't want to know." From there was an arched ceiling tunnel going into another room with another bricked-up doorway. This room had a room above it on the main ground floor, which was made of stone and covered in quarry tiles. During our first tour when we started working there, we were taken to the ground floor room with the quarry tiles and told that when they had a medium or psychic come to visit, they always warned them not to disturb or dig under that room, or to relay the floor as it was full of evil. Being the curious teenager that I was, I used to go down there quite a lot to see if I could take a brick out of the bricked-up doorway with the intention of shining a torch in to see what was there. Having all the modern tools at my disposal, I still couldn't get a brick out. Scraping the mortar joints with a bolster chisel and whacking it with a lump hammer, it simply bounced off. Something down there was telling me to break through, but I couldn't do it. I would have dreams about walking through the cellar and hearing a voice screaming for help. I can't explain how uneasy I felt about going down there alone, but I also had the feeling that I needed to rescue someone or something from behind that wall. Whilst plastering in a room upstairs in the servants' quarters, we would hear people walking around, an indecipherable chatter, only to go back down to see no one there, only the tools and mixing baths we used for mixing the plaster. In other rooms, we would see children run past the doorways. I should note that no doors had been fitted yet. And then the most startling thing of all, what seemed like an adult slowly walking past in period clothing. As we were working next to the open museum part of the modern building, we thought there were members of staff there from next door dressed up. But when we approached them to say they were on an active building site, they needed to wear PPE such as hats and boots, they would simply turn and walk through the walls. I also worked on Congrave's Hall, which was the next stately build down the road. The same things happened there. We were always looking for the legendary tunnel that linked Haden Hall to Congrave's Hall through the cellars. It supposedly also led to a pub called The Crown that once stood at the bottom of the road, but this is now a housing estate. I would love to get back into the place to see if I can feel the same feelings, but it's hardly ever open anymore. I have so many stories about Haden Hall. If you can arrange for us to go in there, I'd give you the real tour. Kindest regards, Mike. Mike, we would absolutely love to do that. I feel a return to Haden Hall is overly due, but after hearing your ghostly story, I await this return visit with some trepidation. Our next story was sent in by Jack and involves a frightening encounter with a mysterious, inexplicable figure, the memory of which still haunts him to this day. Here is his story. Hi there, hope all is well. I'm fairly new to the show, but I'm loving every episode. I've been binging them all and saw you did listener stories, so thought I'd share something that I still really don't have an explanation for to this day. I'm 19 and currently living just south of Leeds. This story goes back to when I was no more than 9 or 10 years old. It was the summer holidays, and since my parents were at work, I was being cared for by my grandparents. To my surprise, they'd planned a lovely day out to Bolton Abbey near Skipton, about an hour away from where we lived. So we set off quite early. I'd packed my Wellington boots and a football. As I recall, it was a glorious day, not a cloud in the sky. We'd parked up on a grass verge and gone to have a dip in the river, then kicked the football around, which all seemed fairly normal. Being a young child, I suggested playing hide and seek around the grounds. My grandfather happily obliged, and I ran off towards a nearby abbey to find the best hiding spot. I perched behind a small wall in view of the church nave and the many headstones dotted around the grounds. I was hunkered down, quite pleased with myself, certain that my grandfather wouldn't find me anytime soon, when I noticed something from the corner of my eye. A sort of shadow. I turned, but there was nothing there. I thought nothing of it, gave my eyes a rub, and waited as I could see my grandfather beginning to come up the path. I watched intently, preparing for my hiding spot to be discovered. As my grandfather got halfway up the path, the shadow appeared again. I turned and, to my surprise, saw a dark figure. A silhouette, reminiscent of a monk, standing completely still in the middle of the church nave. It wasn't a clear apparition. It felt more like looking through frosted glass, but I could tell it was there. It was a warm, sunny, late July day, so there were quite a lot of people milling about, but no one seemed to notice this dark apparition in the middle of the priory as they came up the path. I stood, fixated on this figure, until my grandfather came up behind and playfully scared me out of my hiding spot. I continued staring at the figure until it glided towards the right and vanished. I scurried back to my grandmother, clearly distressed, and begged to go home. I didn't speak of that experience for many years, until a friendly conversation about the paranormal in my high school days drew it out of me. I still don't know what I saw that day, whether it was a trick of the light or truly an entity of some sort. I have always believed in the paranormal, and after doing research recently, it seems there have been sightings of a spectral monk in that location. I did return to the area 2-3 years after the incident to attend a birthday party at a venue near the site, but couldn't bring myself to take a walk to the priory, and strongly doubt I'll be doing so in the future. Keep up the great work. Thanks, Jack. Our next story comes from an anonymous listener whose job as a police officer in Bedford involved not only dealings with real-life criminals, but possibly an encounter with a long-departed one. Our anonymous listener writes, "I don't know if you're still looking for more stories, as I'm still working my way through the episodes, but listening to them reminded me of an incident that occurred when I was a police officer in Bedford 18 or 19 years ago. I was crewed up with another officer for a night shift when we received a call about an alarm activation at the Magistrates Court in the early hours of the morning. Whilst we waited for the key holder to arrive, we conducted a perimeter check and found all doors and windows to be secure. Once the key holder arrived, the alarm was turned off, and the three of us proceeded to search the building for potential intruders. We concluded that no one had got in. The only people in the building were myself, my fellow officer, and the key holder. At least, we were the only living people. During our search, we checked a room that was typically used as a family court. As we left that room, we turned off the lights and shut the door. The room was located at the end of a corridor. We proceeded to walk to the opposite end of the corridor and turned off the hallway light. We were preparing to move to the next area when we noticed a sliver of light under the door of the family courtroom. The key holder sighed and returned to the room to turn the light off again before rejoining us at the opposite end of the corridor. Within seconds, we saw the same sliver of light coming from under the door of the family courtroom again. This happened 5 times in a row before the key holder shouted in exasperation, "Cut it out, Hanratty! I want to get back to bed." Nothing further happened after this, and the three of us quickly ensured the building was secured, then left. James Hanratty, known as the A6 murderer, was tried and convicted at Bedfordshire Assizes, later to become the Magistrates Court. He was sentenced to death and hanged in Bedford Prison in 1962. becoming one of the last people executed in this country before capital punishment was abolished. Following his execution, there was a lot of debate about the conviction and guilt of Han Ratty, until an appeal in the early 2000s, around 4 years before my experience, used DNA evidence to conclusively link him to the crime. From the anonymous listener. And that story has chilled me to the very core. Thank you so much for sharing what must have been such a disconcerting experience. Next, we have a set of stories sent in by Callum, whose eerie adventure begins in the countryside of Cambridgeshire, before moving on to Hampshire and ending with a frightening encounter at the infamous Racton Ruins in West Sussex. Callum writes, I just want to say a huge thank you for creating such an awesome podcast series. Of course, I also want to thank all the people who share their paranormal and otherworldly experiences, as sadly even in a modern society, many of us will get ridiculed or judged if we share these stories. So this feels like a safe place to talk about them with open-minded people. I would like to share 4 encounters that I've had with the paranormal, 3 short and interesting experiences, and 1 very terrifying encounter. I may share a few of my father's experiences as well in the future. I'll need his permission, of course, and a few further of my own. I'm what is considered a rational believer. I try to debunk paranormal events with scientific or natural logic. I'm a technical person who works in cybersecurity, so these experiences below are what I would consider as 100% credible from my perspective. Let's begin with the first experience. I used to live in the countryside of Cambridge, UK, in a lovely hamlet called Little Abington. I'm an avid hiker in my free time, and such a rural area is definitely considered a walker's paradise. I was on one of my typical weekly hikes through the fields around Little Abington on a bright sunny day with a fresh breeze. I was in the middle of a field, completely alone, minding my own business and taking in the scenery as one does while out walking on such a beautiful day. Suddenly, out of nowhere and clear as day, I hear a very strong farmer's accent ask, "Oi, what are you doing here?" directly in my ear. I should add, I was walking along a public path in this field, which for non-UK listeners means you have the right to walk on that land as long as you remain on the specified path. I jumped in surprise upon hearing the voice. I turned around to respond and was shocked to find there wasn't a soul around. I genuinely thought a farmer had come up from behind to give me a good telling off. As I said previously, I was in the middle of a field, with a clear view of my surroundings, and can say with absolute certainty that there was no one there. As you can imagine, I made a swift exit out of that field. Now for my second experience, which occurred approximately a year after the first one. I'd moved to Bolton, Hampshire, UK, also a lovely little country town. As you may have already guessed, there were plenty of hiking routes through this countryside as well. I was renting a room in a terraced house in the northeastern part of town and worked remotely as part of my job in IT. This house definitely had a vibe, not a negative one, but I definitely felt I was not alone, especially at night when downstairs watching the TV. To give context of the downstairs layout, as you entered the front door, the living room was to the right, which then proceeded into the open-plan kitchen. Think of an upside-down L shape. Being an avid musician, I kept my guitar on a stand downstairs, so during my lunch breaks, I would practice or play some songs. Important to note, my guitar leans into the stand at a 35 to 45 degree angle. The only way it would come off is if you were to grab the neck of the guitar and pull it towards you. One afternoon, I was working from the table in the open-plan kitchen. The table was pushed up against the wall, so I had a clear view of the living room and my guitar. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my guitar more or less being pulled out of the stand. I don't mean sideways, which I would be able to logically explain. I mean, it literally went forward off the stand and fell flat face onto the living room floor as though someone had pulled it off. I was quite startled, but more worried about my guitar. I rushed over to check and saw that fortunately my guitar was undamaged by the inexplicable and bizarre incident. Being an IT guy, I attempted to reproduce the problem and concluded the only way the guitar could have come off the stand that way would be with physical force. The house does not lean at any odd angles, and there were no odd vibrations at the time which could have caused the guitar to lift off its stand in that way. I still try to reproduce the experience to this day. The third experience is a very interesting one. In my free time, to alleviate the stress of work, I meditate for mindfulness, but also spiritually. One day whilst meditating, two names randomly popped into my head: George and Michael. Again, quite random, but I was aware this occasionally occurs when daydreaming or whilst in a meditative state. Also around this time, I had joined a local paranormal group where some members claimed to have psychic abilities. During the bi-weekly meetup, I decided to share this story with the group. At the far end of the table, one of the women looked at me, surprised, and shared something with me which I still cannot fathom was even possible. She stated that she meditated the day before the meeting, and two names came into her head specifically for me, which she wrote down on her notebook, and you guessed it, George and Michael were the names. I feel it's important to note that I was watching the group the entire time I was telling my story. I would have seen her write in her notebook if this was a trick. I had no connection to this woman on social media or any form outside the meetup, so I still cannot explain how she had come up with those same names. Even more perplexing is that my great-grandfather was called George, and my maternal grandfather, whom I never met, was called Michael. I still cannot explain it. Maybe there is more up there than we know. Now for my fourth and final experience. I don't want to prime your imagination, but if you do your own research on Racton Ruins, which is located north of Chichester in West Sussex, UK, you will note the ominous past of the ruins themselves and the paranormal experiences reported at this location. My final story begins approximately 10 years ago on a chilly October evening. Myself and two friends, I'll name them A and B for privacy purposes, decided to go on a ghost hunt and explore the ruins late at night. What we all saw and encountered that night is still inexplicable to this day. Understandably, we had, as one would say, primed our imaginations with ghostly intentions, but this still does not explain what we all saw. We were exploring the ruins, searching for ghosts or sign of anything paranormal, laughing and joking to take the edge off our self-created fears and apprehension. Suddenly, we heard an indecipherable whispering sound. It seemed to surround us. This was not related to wind, as it was a completely still night. I shined the light from my phone in front of me, and what I saw, lit in that tiny beam of light, absolutely terrified me. 10 to 20 meters in front of me was a black shadow. So dark, it made an outline against the darkness of our environment. It stood stock still and was an imposing 6.5 feet tall. There were no discernible features to help me conclude whether it was human, animal, or some sort of being. "What the hell is that?" I asked my friends once the initial paralyzing shock had washed over me. Both of them looked in the direction of the beam of light shining from my phone and saw the same black shadow. If I had seen it and they had not, I would have put this down to my imagination. Now, this is where the story truly turns chilling and unexplainable. This black shadow, whatever it is, began to move towards us at a brisk pace. Even more disconcerting was that it did not walk. It floated towards us, apparently having no legs. As you can imagine, we were utterly terrified. We turned and ran in unison to escape the shadow and the apparently cursed ruins. To this very day, I seek to understand what occurred that night, because unfortunately for me, the nightmare didn't end there. We dropped A off at his house and I asked B if I could sleep over at his place, to which he agreed without hesitation. I slept on the floor of B's room, with his little white Scottish terrier Marco sleeping next to me. I recall putting salt along the door and the windows of the room that night, believing this would prevent evil entities from entering the room. It may sound silly to some, but I was primed at that time and my fear was through the roof. It turned out to be a good move on my part. I'm tempted to blame an overreactive imagination, or perhaps fear or adrenaline for what happened next, but I know deep in my being that what occurred was all too real. I remember it clearly as the night it happened. I was lying on the floor in B's bedroom. B was fast asleep. How he slept through this ordeal, I'll never know. Marco the dog woke up and let out a deep, guttural growl at the closed door as though he sensed an intruder. The hallway light was on, letting a shaft of light shine under the gap between the bottom of the door and the floor. I knew the dog well enough to know he would never growl at a family member. Startled, I woke and looked under the door and saw a black shadow formed by the hallway light. The shadow began to move rapidly backwards and forwards in an odd and disturbing motion, as though it wanted to enter the room. Marco the dog began to growl more loudly and even let out a few muffled barks. I felt fear grip my heart and attempted to wake B, who was fast asleep in his bed. "Mate, wake up!" On the other side of the door, the shadow carried on moving back and forth. An interminable 10 minutes later, the shadow suddenly vanished. It didn't leave or move out of my field of vision, but rather disintegrated, evaporated. Marco instantly calmed down. I tried to rationalize, putting the incident down to someone making noises upstairs, but I hadn't heard any footsteps or people moving around, and this still wouldn't have explained the shadow moving in such a strange way. I carried on trying to find an explanation, perhaps a fly on the hallway light causing the shadow, but the shadow was moving in patterns, and a fly wouldn't make Marco so upset. I've never really talked about this encounter. I did, however, speak of it with A about 3 months ago, when he had a social gathering at his house. I asked whether he thought there really was a shadow at the ruins, or whether he thought it was all in our heads. He turned to me and said he couldn't explain what he saw that night, and admitted it still disturbed him to this day. If I'd have been the only one to see it, I would have put it down to a hallucination, but there were 3 of us there that night, and we all saw the same thing, in the exact same place. I'll leave it for you to decide. Thank you for reading my stories. Callum. Callum, thank you so much. The story of the shadowy figure outside the room will stay with me for a long time. Perhaps Racton Ruins should be a subject of a future episode. Although as for visiting the place, I may have to muster up some courage to do that anytime soon. Now we hear from Alex, who shares a predisposition for the paranormal and unexplained occurrences with his father. His story begins in a small shop in Essex. He writes, "Hi, my name is Alex. I grew up in Dagenham in Essex. I love the podcast. I can't turn it off. I've always believed in something, such as people not moving on, and have had a few strange experiences over the years. Growing up, I remember my dad would have to go and reset the alarm at his electrical shop at 3 a.m. He always said it was just his mate in the shop playing tricks. As I got older, I would help him in the shop after school, restocking, etc. I always found the stairs leading to the second floor of the shop evoked a very strange feeling. I would run down them as I didn't want to spend more time on them than I needed to. I put it down to being young and impressionable. My dad persuaded me to follow in his footsteps and become an electrician. As I neared the end of my time as an apprentice, I found myself in the shop on my own one day, while my dad had gone home for his break. I was at the front of the shop practicing for my last exam when I heard footsteps upstairs from the front of the shop, which was a converted house. The footsteps went across the hallway to the rear of the house, then back towards the front, over and over. I assumed the sound was coming from the neighbouring shop, so I carried on working. A short while later, the footsteps resumed, front to back, back to front, but this time, I heard them on the stairs. Having walked those stairs hundreds of times, I knew the creak of each and every step. I heard the footsteps on the top few stairs, then nothing. I stood up to have a look but didn't see or hear anything further, so I carried on working. As I was kneeling on the floor to measure something, I got a sudden and uneasy feeling that I was being watched from the rows of shelving at the back of the shop. I looked up and was shocked to see a man peeking around the corner at me. He was wearing black jeans, a black top, and had black hair. I noted his facial features as he carried on staring at me. Something about him made my blood run cold, and I let out a surprised shout. "Ah!" In a split second, the man was gone. I phoned my dad, told him what I'd seen, and begged him to come back right away. He had locked the front door of the shop when he left. The second set of keys was at the back door, and I certainly was not going back there. My dad returned about half an hour later to find me at the front of the shop, white as a sheet. I never saw the strange man again, but the experience has stuck with me ever since. Another incident occurred when I was young and on holiday in Wales. My family and I stayed in a large house with heavy wooden doors. As me and my friend were the youngest, we were allowed to choose our room, so we took the one at the top of the stairs. At around 2 a.m. one night, I heard someone coming up the stairs. I assumed it was my friend as the toilet was downstairs. As the footsteps reached the top step, I heard a banging noise as if he'd fallen from the top to the bottom. I sat up expecting to hear screams of pain and was shocked to find my friend sound asleep in his bed. Almost every night that week around the same time, I heard someone walking up the stairs. Reaching the top, then the rattle and bang of them falling back down. It was like this entity was stuck having to relive a horrible moment in time. These next stories were relayed to me by my dad, who told them after I mentioned the man hiding behind the shelving in his shop. My dad would often be in the shop late or very early on a Saturday morning. I recall him telling me about the time when he was making coffee in the shop's kitchen. The stairs came down into the kitchen, and from there you would walk into the shop. He was waiting for the kettle to boil when he heard walking upstairs. He assumed it was one of the office ladies come to catch up on some paperwork, so he called up, but had no answer. A moment later, as he carried on making his coffee, he felt someone walk by him towards the shop. He turned and saw someone walk past the window that was between the main building and the outbuilding. However, when he went to check who it was, the deadbolt in the back door was still locked, with the keys still in it. Another time, my dad had been working late when he had the feeling he was being watched. He had a stool that he would use while working at his computer to type up his month's figures. That night, he saw a little boy sitting on his stool at the corner of his eye. My dad looked at the boy, who smiled back at him and carried on looking at what my dad was doing on the monitor. My dad turned to look at his monitor, and when he looked back towards the stool, the boy was gone. My dad described the boy being dressed in old-style clothing and having blonde hair. My dad would sometimes stop in the local pub on his way home after a long day at work. One night, he mentioned the incident to someone and described the boy. He was told that an old lady who used to frequent the pub had lost her son after he was hit by a car outside the shop. This had occurred a long time ago, and the woman had apparently never gotten over it. There you have it. I just wanted to share my stories, as every time I hear your listeners' stories, I'm reminded of my experiences. Keep up the great work. Thank you, Alex, for such fascinating stories. To me, they pose questions about the different types of hauntings we can have and how some people are perhaps more open to tapping into a frequency. Both Alex and his dad both saw an apparition which seemed to interact with them in some way, either by staring at them directly or clearly watching what they were doing. The falling down the stairs to me seems a different kind of haunting, perhaps a residual haunting, the energy of a horrific moment, not being able to move on from the foundations of that holiday home. It would be very interesting to find out what occurred there in the past. Thank you again, Alex, for coming forward and sharing your experiences. This next story is both shiver-inducing and greatly disturbing. It happened to one of our listeners called Shirley, who recounts. We were in the midst of the COVID pandemic. I'd already taken up jewelry making, just the bog standards such as gem bracelets and basic charm earrings. One evening, I was working on the couch with my dog, Bria, curled up next to me. I placed my work on a table in the living room and went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. As I walked back into the living room, I was shocked to see a stranger in an Alice in Wonderland style blue jacket with bright yellow trimming on the cuffs and pockets. The strange character was slightly bent over the living room table, gazing at my jewelry with admiration. I stood for a while, transfixed, both of us remaining perfectly still. Me focused on him, and he focused on my handiwork. Eventually, his head began to rise slowly between his arms as his back straightened out. I noticed he had a goatee-type beard, and for a brief moment, feared perhaps I'd come face to face with Satan. So I quickly glanced down at his feet and saw that they were hooves. My dog woke and briefly lifted her head to take a look, then put it back down and carried on sleeping. My head was spinning as I'd read quite a bit about the disguises of Satan in my books and how he can morph into various forms. In this instance, his eyes were very wide. He had a strange nose and small pouting lips. He was half man, half goat, and this face was golden coloured with tinges of grey white and black. The stranger finally turned, stared at me in disbelief for a moment, then disappeared. It was time for me to walk the dog, and I thought getting outside would be a good distraction. I slipped the lead onto Bria's collar and took the yellow field Labrador out for her daily outing. As we walked, I ran the events of the last hour or so through my head and tried to make light of what had happened, what I'd seen. When I got home, I phoned my sister to get her thoughts on the matter, but she was simply at a loss for words. I must admit, out of the entire ordeal, I was most proud of my dog Bria, who throughout the experience never showed fear. In fact, she didn't even growl. Shirley. That is a very peculiar experience, and thank you, Shirley. What I find really interesting is that this faun-type creature was just as surprised to see you in the room. It makes you wonder about the universe, and different dimensions perhaps. Our next story comes from an anonymous listener all the way in Australia. This person grew up in the UK and has a long history of strange experiences. Here are the ones they've chosen to share with us. Hi there. I recently discovered your podcast and have thoroughly enjoyed listening. I'm now up to date after binge listening while driving, baking, sewing, and even while walking my dog. Great stories and captivating storytelling. Thank you. I've had enough strange experiences in my 48 years to convince me that there is more to this world than what we see with our eyes. From childhood right into my early 20s, I lived in an old North London town very close to the site of a large battle that was part of the War of the Roses in 1471. This town was far enough from the centre of London that historically, travellers going north on the Great North Road would reach there by evening and rest with their horses, then venture onwards from one of the many pubs and inns. In some cases, the unfortunate ones would come across highwaymen ready to rob them. This town has had a market since the year 1199, which gives you an idea of the amount of history found there. One house I lived in was close to the site of the aforementioned battle and the gallows that had existed at the time. I was fairly young. It would have been in the mid to late 80s. That house had always been creepy. My parents purchased it in a state of disrepair, but my father renovated it into a lovely large 4-bedroom home in a fantastic location. At some point, and I have no idea why, my father purchased an old piano from an estate sale. At this time, we had a Jack Russell dog. One afternoon, I came home from school with a friend and found the piano plonked in the middle of the lounge and the dog shut in the kitchen. Naturally, we decided to make some noise and started to play the piano, and my friend felt what she thought was my dog brush past her legs. She even said hello and leaned down to pet it. But there was no dog. We decided to check, and the dog was asleep in her basket in the kitchen, with 2 closed doors between us and her. We didn't think too much of it in the moment and brushed it off as our overactive imaginations. However, there were nights when I would be curled up reading a book in my cabin bed and suddenly notice a soft purring sound. I recall thinking it was something making a noise, perhaps the crinkling of the posters on the wall beside my bed where I was leaning. I would stop and focus, even hold my breath, and stay very still to have a really good listen, and the sound would continue. Looking down at the bedding, I would see a hollow depression just the right size for a curled-up cat. It is worth noting that we'd never had a cat, and living so close to the main high street, it wasn't likely that a cat would have simply wandered in. The most brazen act of the ghost cat happened one evening when we were settled in the lounge watching TV. Back in those days, cassette Walkmans were popular, and I'd received one for my birthday. I'd left it on the sideboard in the lounge, where a pair of candlesticks and some family photos were also on display. While me, my brother and my mum were watching the TV, which was on the other side of the room, we heard a bang and noticed one of the candlesticks had been knocked over. A moment later, and my Walkman, standing on its side not far from the candlestick, had also toppled over. A beat or two later, the second candlestick fell. The timing of each item being knocked over made it feel as though an invisible cat had walked across the top of the sideboard and knocked each item down as it passed by. We looked at each other in disbelief, but I immediately knew what had caused the disturbance. I also experienced strange disturbances in this house as I tried to fall asleep at night. I would hear someone breathing with a heavy, raspy breath that would get closer and closer until it was right beside the bed. Most times I would be frozen in terror, although sometimes I was able to bolt from the room, run downstairs and burst into the lounge in the safety of my parents, who would still be awake watching TV. One night, I recall running downstairs and bursting into the lounge, only to find it pitch dark. I hadn't realized it was late enough for them to be in bed, which only increased my terror. The only other odd experience I recall from this house was when my younger brother and I were up late in the large converted loft space my dad had built for us. We had a pool table up there, as well as a small black and white portable TV. We were planning to sleep the night up there and were watching the TV quite late when we both noticed something odd. We looked at each other and both said, "Did you see that?" We'd noticed the movie was suddenly showing in colour. However, as soon as we noticed it, the screen went back to being black and white. Very odd indeed. I've lived in 2 other houses which had strange and spooky goings-on. I would love to tell you about them if you are in need of more stories. I no longer live in the UK, but listen to you from Adelaide in South Australia, where I haven't had many spooky experiences. However, I lost my dad last year, and I believe he has reached out to me a time or two. Whether he has or whether it's just me subconsciously manifesting, it doesn't matter, as it has given me some comfort, even though our relationship was tumultuous at times. He was a much kinder person in later years, and I believe that the more complicated the relationship, the more complicated the grief. Thanks for reading. I look forward to listening to many more episodes of your fantastic podcast. Kind regards, Anonymous. Now we join listener Ben, who shares a few terrifying experiences he's had throughout his life. From a strange figure in the woods to a disembodied voice, his recollections will send shivers down your spine. And what's more, we return to one of our favourite haunted places on the podcast, Cannock Chase. Ben writes, "Hi, really enjoying your podcast. I'm 42 now, so this event feels like a lifetime ago. When I was in the Scouts, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, I was on a camp at Beaudesert Scout Camp at Cannock Chase. My troop and I went on a walk after our evening meal as it was starting to get dark. I don't know if the layout of the campsite has changed, but in the late 90s there was a small quarry-like area which was perfect for abseiling. We were walking along the path from the main camping area towards this quarry, and I happened to be at the front of our group. When I looked back to check where everyone was, I saw something so unbelievable that I never mentioned it to anyone. One of the scout leaders at the back of our group looked like he was wearing a stag skin cloak, complete with antlers. I seem to remember a kind of glow or hue around it. I blinked once, and it was gone. All I saw was the scout leader as he should be. Cannock Chase is called such because it used to be where the privileged would hunt deer for food and sport. Presumably, there were also poachers who might have used deer skin for clothes or blankets. This particular area of Cannock Chase is not all that far away from Abbots Bromley, where they have the famous horn dance. I wonder how my ghostly vision might fit in with this. This was at a time before I discovered a love and knowledge of paranormal and supernatural happenings. Another incident of note occurred when I went on a commercial ghost hunt at Alton Towers as a volunteer host. At the very start of the night, all the hosts and guests were in the chapel, getting to know how to use divining rods and crystal pendulums. The last step in this process required every member of the group to ask the same question. This was an internal question. Nobody spoke out loud, but the question was, where is the spirit? Each and every divining rod pointed to exactly the same place in the room. As the night progressed, everyone experienced something ranging from small things to occasional things of high significance. However, on this particular night, we were back in the chapel as everyone was leaving, and I was talking with the lead host with my back to the open room. The lead host said something funny, and there was a laugh. A laugh from behind me. I thought nothing of it, as I believed there was another person still there. But the host, her face now stark white, asked me, "Did you hear that?" I said yes and started to turn around to point to the lady and began to say it was her. But I didn't finish those words as I realized we were alone. Some investigators have found the spirit of a young girl in the chapel at Alton Towers. Sincerely, Ben. Next, we head all the way to Melbourne, Australia, with a story from Annie, who had an inexplicable encounter with a stranger who appeared to have supernatural powers. Hi Steve, I'm loving the listeners' stories on your podcast and thought you may be interested in a somewhat weird experience I had. This happened on a Monday morning about 20 years ago here in Melbourne, Australia. It was my rostered day off work, and I'd been to the gym for a workout. Around 7 a.m, as I was making my way home, I approached an intersection where I saw a woman also wanting to cross the road. There was nearly no one else around, so I took notice of her appearance. She was middle-aged, but wearing the type of clothes a much younger woman would wear: short skirt, brief top, and high heels. I wondered if she was a streetwalker on her way home and watched as she pressed the button for the pedestrian crossing. I stood directly behind her, completely silent. This road always took an inordinate amount of time for the lights to change. We'd been stood waiting a while, when suddenly she turned to face me and angrily said, "Stop laughing at me!" I was gobsmacked, as I had been silent the entire time. It was as though she'd been reading my mind. I think I stammered out an apology, as I was well and truly busted. I must admit I still feel deeply ashamed that I'd been so judgmental of her. Luckily, the lights changed, and we crossed the road. I quickly sped past her and rushed home. This incident has always stayed with me, as I don't understand how she possibly could have read my thoughts. I'm definitely more careful now about judging other people. Keep up the great work. Annie. From Australia, we skip across to New Zealand with a story from an anonymous listener whose father has connections to eerie happenings in the area. Here is their story. Hi Steve, I have a couple of stories that involve my dad having a paranormal experience in my hometown of Waipukurau in New Zealand. I'd like to remain anonymous for this story. Before I was born in the early 1960s, my mum gave birth to my brother, who sadly was born severely disabled. He remained in hospital as he wasn't well enough to come home. One evening, my dad was in a pub having a drink with a colleague, and as he tried to lift his glass from the table, he found he inexplicably couldn't lift it. Perplexed, he felt inclined to call my mum to ask how the baby was doing. My mum told him she'd been to the hospital earlier and the baby was as well as could be expected. The baby passed away the next day. This perhaps was indicative of the psychic intuitive experiences he'd had throughout his life, and which my story will later detail. I'm a member of a local Facebook group which shared the 50th anniversary of a very strange occurrence at the local aerodrome a few years ago. I will relay it to you as it does somewhat relate to my dad, and I think you and your listeners will find it to be of interest. Late at night, as the security guard on duty was patrolling, it was reported that there may be a dog on the loose, as the sheep in the paddock had been disturbed. The security guard heard a humming noise, similar to the noise a vacuum cleaner makes. He heard his dog growling and spotted some unusual reflections in the windows of a nearby hangar. When he turned to see where they were coming from, he saw 3 lights, 2 green separated by a red light, coming from something that seemed to be hovering about 20 meters above the ground. The humming appeared to be coming from the large object in the air. He estimated the suspended object to be at least 20 meters across and watched, terrified, as it tilted towards him, then shot up into the air at an angle. The security guard ran behind the hangar to keep tracking the object's movements, but by the time he got there, it had vanished. He then measured 19 paces where the air above the ground appeared warm, immediately below where he estimated the object had been hovering, and noted the grass there was warm and wet. The security guard reported the incident to the local police station. He told the police that the object had headed in the direction of Pukiora, which was southwest of the town he was in. It had headed in the general direction of 2 farming families who reported they had heard what they thought was a jet passing over. Quite separately, a farmer reported that his sheep had been unusually disturbed around the same time, and a visitor to Hawke's Bay, driving State Highway 2 towards Waipukurau, reported what appeared to be a dark object over the aerodrome in the distance, on what were clear early morning conditions. The visitor reported that the object appeared to be circular and was stationary about 100 feet above the ground. He said it gradually gained height and abruptly took off southwards. I was a toddler in 1969, so obviously have no recollection of any of this. Some of my Facebook friends recall a lot of strange lights in the sky throughout 1969. I would love to ask my dad about this, as he used to fly gliders at the aerodrome and certainly would remember this story. Sadly, he passed away in 2018. I also recall my dad telling me stories about how he'd had some psychic flashes. In the 1980s and 90s, he worked as a farmer. One day, while in a paddock, he was suddenly overcome with a strong sense that the bull was going to charge him. Sure enough, Dad quickly turned around to the sight of the bull charging towards him and narrowly escaped harm, as he had had enough warning to jump out of the way. He also told me how he astral traveled at night, and that one night he dreamt he was flying over the old local theatre. I hope you find this interesting. The content regarding the UFO was sourced from the Hawke's Bay Today newspaper. Best regards, Anonymous. This next story also comes from an anonymous source and takes place at a royal residence, where a disembodied force and an apparition seem to linger. Here is their story. Hi Steve. I hope all is well. I'm really enjoying the podcast and wanted to share a story that recently happened to me at work for your Listener Stories episode. I would like to remain anonymous due to work reasons. The names in this story have been altered. I haven't told anyone this story. I started a job at a royal residence we will call TC a few weeks back. I carry out day-to-day operations such as bin duties, setups, hoovering, etc. One of our tasks at the end of a workday is to shut the doors, turn off the lights, and be ready for the morning. My colleague and I worked around each side of the public-facing rooms, which are part of the guided tour, so everyone can see them. I'd finished my rounds and shut the large wooden doors at the end of one of the halls on the public side of the building. I was walking back to my break room. The blinds were down and the lights were off, which left the hallway rather dark. Suddenly I turned around as I thought I heard something behind me. Shocked, I watched the doors I had just securely shut get flung open, smashing against the walls with enough force to nearly break the hinges. These were big, heavy doors that could not have moved on their own. I stood immobile for a long moment, confused, until I could only conclude that this was just a silly prank. I shouted hello. Nothing. I thought it was strange, so I walked to that side of the hall, only to find no one was there. I shut the doors again and hurried back to the break room, a little bit shook up. I turned to look behind me again, and I cannot begin to tell you what I saw, but it was a man in Regency clothing perched by the doorway to one of the state public rooms. We stood and stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then he suddenly disappeared. I felt a shiver of shock go down my spine. I shook my head, then speed walked back to the break room, where I found my colleague having a cup of tea. He asked where I'd been and why I looked so pale. I asked if he was the one who flung the doors open in the hall, to which he laughed and said no, and that he hadn't been back to that side of the building since we'd parted. I still don't understand what it was that I saw. Perhaps my brain was playing tricks? I really don't know. But what I do know is that I no longer do that job alone, because it does give me the creeps. Hope you enjoy this, Steve. A rather interesting one. Regards, Anonymous. Our final set of stories was sent in by another anonymous listener who had a truly frightening experience which has always stayed with him. However, it's his grandfather's tale which we close with. When we first read it here at Haunted UK Podcast Towers, we were genuinely astonished, amazed by this really quite perplexing encounter. The story details an incredibly disturbing meeting he had with two kindly strangers, in fact, two women, in a house beyond the gates. We'll let our listener continue. Hi there. Hope you're keeping well. I've been enjoying the podcast so far, having listened to many episodes already. Thank you for taking your time and putting together such a great piece of work. I've been somewhat hesitant to share my stories due to the nature of them and how distressed I was after one particular incident. It is for this reason that I would like to remain anonymous. The first experience is that of my own. At the time, I blamed it on nightmares or sleep paralysis, but the experience stopped after I left my uni house. About 2 years ago, I lived with 3 friends in an older terraced house along the Lisburn Road in Belfast. Like all the homes there, the house was at least 200 years old. I was usually on my own during the weekends, as my housemates worked part-time jobs outside the city, though I had managed to get an internship and usually worked Friday evenings. One Friday night, after settling down and getting into bed, I found I simply couldn't fall asleep as there was an inexplicable feeling of unease keeping me awake. I knew I was alone, but my brain wouldn't let my body relax. After struggling for some time, I finally managed to fall asleep. But just as I was dozing off, I distinctly remember hearing my bedroom door open. And during my sleep, or whatever state my brain was in between consciousness and unconsciousness, I saw a little girl with dark hair. The little girl never came close to my bed, and I could not make out her face. I got a strange, disconcerting feeling that she was studying me. I woke in a panic and found I was alone with my bedroom door closed. This experience happened multiple times until one night, the little girl approached my bed and screamed a sound that would strike fear, even in the bravest person. I continued to experience this time and time again, which made it very difficult to sleep in that room. I grew to be exhausted, shook up, and frightened about what was happening to me. Due to this, along with other issues in the house, I decided to move out early. I didn't care that I was paying rent for a house I was living in. I simply couldn't be there anymore. Anyone I tell this to thinks I'm crazy, but I needed out, and I know what I experienced. Another odd thing happened to me in that room. I had a friend staying, and we both woke the next morning in a panic, saying that we felt as if there were cats crawling over us in our sleep. We checked to ensure the bedroom window was closed, as the neighbours' cats would often make their way into the house. The window was indeed closed. Freaky. As I said, I haven't experienced any of these strange occurrences since moving out of that house. After leaving the house, I moved back home, and I now live in a different house in Belfast, and nothing like that has ever happened again. I'm unsure if it was the stress of uni, working on a part-time job while also having an internship, or if there was genuinely something trapped in that house that couldn't move on. Either way, I think I'm content in never knowing and never having to return. The second story I will share happened to my grandfather, a religious man who never believed in or told any stories of this nature, until something out of the ordinary happened. A self-employed plumber by trade, he was of retirement age, though he considered himself semi-retired. He was completing a small job one evening in late October last year outside a town about an hour's drive from his home. On the way back, he noticed a car parked to the side of the road with the hazard lights on, so he stopped to see if the occupants needed help. When he pulled over, he saw two women in the car. One about middle age, perhaps 40 to 50 years old, and the other a younger woman in her 20s. He asked the women if they needed any help, and the older woman answered that her husband would lift the car in the morning, but that they would be grateful to get a lift home. My grandfather, being the gentleman he is, graciously offered to give them a lift. He drove the women home, and in true Irish fashion, they invited him in for a cup of tea to say thanks. My grandfather accepted their offer and went into the house for a cup of tea. Upon entering the house, my granddad instantly felt a heaviness in the air, a feeling he had never felt before. Uneasy, he made sure to keep his phone by him at all times, only putting it down on the coffee table when drinking his tea. My grandfather and the women had a brief conversation, discussing mundane things such as the weather and what they did for a living. The older woman openly said her husband was working late for the RUC, which was an odd thing to say, as the RUC had not been the active police service of Northern Ireland for some time. And due to the politics of Northern Ireland, working for the police was not something people would typically share for personal safety reasons. As the conversation came to a close, my grandfather thanked the women for their hospitality, gave them his best wishes on their broken-down car, and said his goodbyes. My grandfather had been driving for about 10 to 15 minutes after leaving the house when he realized he'd left his phone there. He turned around and drove straight back to the house to retrieve it. Upon pulling up to the property, he noticed all of the lights had gone out and that the front gate had been closed. When his car lights hit the gates, he saw that they were overgrown with briars and other greenery. Beyond the gates, he saw the house was completely boarded up. My grandfather noticed an opening in the door, so he entered the house and found his way to the room where, moments before, he'd been having tea with the two women. Unnerved, he noticed the house looked as though it had been abandoned and ransacked years ago. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the coffee table and saw his phone right where he'd left it. Needless to say, he raced to the car and left straight away. My grandmother says she remembers him coming home looking like he'd just seen a ghost. He couldn't speak and said he couldn't explain what he'd just experienced. My grandfather does not frighten easily, but this experience shook him to the core of his being, a feeling that lingered for a very long time. Looking for answers, he even went to his minister, but there wasn't much they could offer in the way of an answer. They were perplexed just as he was. The only suggestion was that maybe this was a trauma response to something, but my grandfather does not feel any trauma from anything. The house in question isn't local and is a good 30 minutes away. My grandfather asked his friend who lives nearby, and apparently distant figures were reported often seen coming and going around it. Yet it remained empty. Recently, it's been bought and renovated, so we may hear more stories. But for now, it's a puzzle of a house, which was full of life and in order, but in an instant became a ramshackle, became empty, overgrown, beyond the gates. Hope you enjoy these stories. It feels good to tell someone who won't think I'm crazy. Again, thank you. Well, that story has truly mystified me, and I can imagine your grandfather was greatly troubled by this. What did happen that night? Was this a time slip? After all, the reality seemed real. He even drank the tea. He was in their house. Or was it two apparitions on the road? Will we ever know? If anybody has a theory, please let us know. We would love to hear from you. To me, this is another example of how we just can never fully understand the working of the universe. And so that, dear listeners, is where we'll be finishing this episode. But don't worry, because there are more listener stories episodes to come. More fantastic tales, more shocks, more scares, more intrigue. So until then, just keep in mind that the paranormal can strike out at any time, whether you're in a small shop, playing in a churchyard, or driving down a desolate road at night. It's these types of scenarios that seem so completely normal to us all, but in an instant, they can be turned on their heads. And if that happens to you, then make sure you write your story down and send it into the show, because the next person whose story could feature in a Listener Stories episode could be you.